Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon and evening to our global attendees who are dialing in from across the world. We're really excited to bring to you today an insider's look at the future of IoT. So today we've gathered some of the leading industry experts in IoT to give you their insights as to what's coming up over the next few years for the IoT industry. So let me first start by introducing myself. I'm Christina Richards, and I'm the VP of Marketing here at ARIS, and I'm privileged today to be your moderator for this esteemed panel. So let me start by introducing the team. Up first, we have Drew Johnson, who is ARIS's VP of Engineering and Operations. Drew, can you say hello to the audience?
Hi, everyone. Good to be here.
Great. We also have Michelle Avery, and she is our VP of Automotive Strategy.
Hello, everyone.
Welcome. And we also have Dr. Rishi Bethangar, who is our president of ARIS India.
Yeah, hi. Hello, everybody.
And last but not least, we have Z Hussain, who's one of our founders and our chief technology officer.
Hi, Christina. Hello, everyone.
Great to have you here. So before I start, I want to let you guys know that you can enter specific questions that you have for the panel at any time in the audience Q&A box that should be on your BrightTalk interface. So just go to that window, enter in your question, and we'll try to incorporate it into the program in real time. Now, before we jump into the panel, I'd like to tell you a little bit about who ARIS is. We are a small but mighty company with almost 300 people that span the globe. Our headquarters are located here in the heart of Silicon Valley in San Jose, California, and that's where I'm located today. But we also have global installations across the world, including a large group of employees in Chicago, as well as in India, and also locations in Japan and the UK. We have three major lines of business: IoT connectivity, IoT platforms, and IoT solutions. And these three lines of business represent distinct segments of our overall corporate offering. Now, IoT is the fundamental connections between IoT nodes, and this is our large part of our business. It's the heart of our business that we started with. IoT platforms is an offering that allows our customers to run their IoT solutions from our connectivity management platform, and that platform has a broad spectrum of capabilities. IoT solutions, for right now, it's really focused heavily in the automotive space, but it also covers industries like finance tech, insurance tech, and health tech, as well as many others. Let's talk a little bit about what ARIS looks like in terms of size, because not everybody's heard of ARIS. And ARIS's network is much larger than many realize. We have operational connectivity reach in 190 countries worldwide. We have over 10 million devices, and these are active devices on our network today. And those 10 million devices drive over 1 billion IoT messages per day. Now, that level of messaging on our network puts us into the top 10 companies globally in terms of IoT units under management. So that puts us right up there with the Vodafones and the AT&Ts and the Verizons of the world. Now, before we move on to the panel, I'd like to stop briefly and take a look back at where the IoT industry ended up in 2017, and then take a quick look at some of the top trends that we're seeing going into 2018 and that we're going to talk about today. So everybody knows, it's not news to anybody on this webinar today, that IoT projections continue to move up and to the right. And depending on who you talk to, some say by 3x in 2020, some say 5x by 2020. IDC in particular notes that in 2021, more than 55% of spending on IoT projects will be for software and services. And consumer IoT spending is expected to reach $62 billion in 2018 alone. So we see this continuous growth of the industry, of investment, and of spend all across all aspects of the industry. Now, we also know that some of the top use cases are related to smart cities and industrial IoT and connected health. But the interesting thing that you'll see is that the sectors that are the biggest today are not necessarily the sectors that have the highest growth velocity. So we look here at just a snapshot of some year-over-year growth in specifically Verizon IoT network connections. And we can see that, as you would expect, manufacturing had a big growth. We also had a big jump in the energy and utilities space, which is something that ARIS can definitely attest to, as we've had a big growth in that area, specifically in solar and renewable energies as well. So in preparation for opening up the panel floor, let me introduce a couple of the trends that we see coming up in 2018 and that we're going to talk about today. First one up, connected cars. So we've come a long way from the introduction of OnStar over 20 years ago, which was the first truly connected car application. And in 2018, we'll continue to see the metamorphosis of automobiles from being mere mechanical modes of transportation into truly portable mobile data centers. And Michelle Avery is going to give us some insight on some of the things that we can expect to see over the next couple of years. Also, the global impact of IoT will continue to expand in 2018, but very different needs are met in different areas of the world by IoT technology. For example, today, Aris is not only a big player in the US and European markets, but we also have multiple installations in Africa, for example, where IoT helps to bring clean water to communities. And we also have one of our major business centers in India, which delivers services that are unique to the Indian and Southeast Asian markets. And Dr. Rishi will tell us a little bit more about those specific unique needs later on. Next up, we've got edge computing. So as the value of distributed computing architectures continues to be recognized, the move to the edge will continue to gain momentum in 2018. And much of that need is really driven by IoT. As we bring the core building blocks of the cloud closer to consumers, it allows for critical improvements in latency and processing efficiency. In fact, IDC predicts that up to 40% of all computing will occur at the edge by 2020. And our VP of Engineering, Drew Johnson, will offer up additional insights into that shift. Now, no IoT 2018 predictions discussion would be complete without mentioning blockchain. It's one of the biggest buzzwords in the industry. And in addition to its value in the financial sector, because it's a distributed and encrypted digital ledger, blockchain seems really well suited for the details of the millions of transactions that take place between IoT machines, especially due to its inherent security benefits that are provided by the architecture. And speaking of security, last but not least, the very biggest topic of 2017 will continue its ever-present status in 2018. By their very nature, the interconnectedness of IoT devices continues to make them prime targets for advanced hacks and ransomware. And for IoT solutions providers, that means ensuring network security is even a higher stakes game than it has ever been before. And our CTO, Zia Hussain, is an expert on all things security, and he'll be weighing in on the good, the bad, and the ugly that we can expect to see happening in 2018. So without further ado, I'd like to shift over to our experts and hear what they have to say on the big topics of 2018. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Morning.
Why don't we start first with our VP of Engineering, Drew Johnson. Drew, let's talk about edge computing. Why is it so important to the success of IoT, and why is it so difficult to implement?
So in short, IoT works better and costs less with edge computing. It works better by allowing more local processing of data on the thing or closer to the thing, which allows activities and actions to happen even without connectivity in some cases. But certainly the responsiveness of actions can be better. And as well, the actual local node, the thing itself, can participate as part of the overall security process, monitoring local security and making sure that nothing abnormal is happening. And then cost less is related to, a lot of experts are saying as much as 60% of the data that gets sent to the cloud wouldn't need to get sent to the cloud if there was appropriate edge computing. So you can imagine, actually, it costs less in the transport of that data. It costs less in the processing of that data back on the cloud. Overall, a lot of accumulated cost savings from doing effective edge computing. And it's hard today. Pretty much most things that are getting created actually are doing a level of edge computing today. The biggest problem is that every single company nearly has to reinvent their edge computing that edge computing environment for themselves, rather than being able to leverage some kind of industry standard. It's sort of the equivalent of, imagine if every company that wanted to put out a PC or even a website had to create their own web browser. It's kind of a very inefficient time right now. And I think 2018, we're going to see some good progress in establishing more standard edge computing environments that can be leveraged across the industry.
Great. And Z, we know that you're the chairman of the IMC Council. In terms of standardization, what do you think are the most important things that we should look at as we potentially try to standardize for that?
Oh, definitely. One of the biggest concerns that people tend to have is that sometimes the standards may not apply to the newer technologies that are being deployed, while there are lots of standards associated with, let's say, the cellular industry and standards associated with the given applications in, for example, the construction industry, making sure that those standards don't conflict and making sure that there is an effort to harmonize or perhaps make sure that there's no issue with implementations of specific items when you're deploying an IoT application. There is an entity called the 1M2M that was formed by a number of the standards organizations around the world, which is focusing on trying to implement a set of IoT standards, including security, including the APIs, including the data transport and storage, which would help deploy these applications more easily in a wide variety of markets, if you will.
Excellent. So let's shift gears a moment and move over to connected and autonomous cars. Michelle, what's the biggest innovation you see coming in the next 2 to 3 years for connected cars?
Well, I think what Drew has been discussing with edge computing is essential for making connected vehicles really, really widespread and being able to leverage the power of the technology out to making autonomous vehicles and mobility as a service a reality. And one of the things that we also need to talk a lot about is security. And I'd actually like to ask my colleague Z a couple of questions about security and the applicability of blockchain. I know you mentioned that early on. Some of the things that we look at in automotive are how can you more efficiently handle security in distributed environments. And I can't think of anything more distributed than a car. It's the ultimate mobile device. And it needs not only edge computing, but it also needs better security. So I'm really hoping, crossing my fingers, that blockchain is actually part of the answer for automotive security. Not to put you on the spot, Z, but I know you're good on the spot.
It's a good place to think about exactly what blockchain can and cannot do. We have to realize that it was designed and developed for a particular capability, for example, the cryptocurrency market, where the transaction rates are not necessarily as high as might occur from a vehicle or an IoT application such as a high-end security monitoring system or something like that, business and alarm security monitoring. That kind of application makes it tough to use blockchain, particularly when you look at the technology having certain delays that the way the transaction ledger is sent around. And the transaction ledger can actually grow pretty quickly, which makes it tough to use under all circumstances. Now, there are people who are trying to implement partial chain technologies, i.e. not transmitting the whole chain, new technologies that might be developed as a part of reducing the amount of overhead that's involved in doing the transaction ledgers, etc. And that may have some value in the near future, but I think it's going to take some time. Now, the automotive space is actually a little bit more interesting. Let me add to something that Drew mentioned, which is the edge computing topic, which is natural for a car. You have the ability for the various sensors in a car to communicate to perhaps one or two higher performance modules where you can implement security solutions. And effectively, that's like edge computing in the vehicle. Other applications such as the alarm industry could have gateways which have the opportunity for implementing security. And if you have a sufficiently powerful device, that's where perhaps a blockchain approach could make sense. But it has to be looked at. Still very early to see how it would be effectively used in any IoT application, particularly at scale when you have millions to billions of devices deployed.
Well, you know, that's a really good point, Z, because one of the things we're seeing in automotive right now is the amount of sensors. If you look at a mechanical LiDAR, a solid state LiDAR, high-efficient cameras, radar, sonar, all of these sensors, right now in testing, they're generating about 8 terabytes of data an hour.
Exactly.
At some point, we need a breakthrough for autonomous vehicles to be able to send the data and secure the data in a much more efficient and effective way. I don't imagine when autonomous vehicles become ubiquitous that they're going to be transmitting that level of data. Right now, it's mostly for machine learning to build up the algorithms and the understanding. But that doesn't seem very feasible to me when it becomes mass produced.
That's exactly right. I think that the whole point behind the amount of data that is necessary for controlling an autonomous vehicle, particularly given the latencies that you need, a lot of that data will stay relatively local to the car, most of it perhaps even. And then that's where I think a blockchain transaction technology to report that information might make sense. But it's still a ways away.
Hey, Michelle, actually just coming back a little bit to the connected cars and autonomous cars in particular, one of the things that I noticed at CES that was announced was the valet use case service. People are really working on that, and I'm actually a big fan of that being, those kinds of use cases being the next evolution of actually autonomous driving. What do you see as actually possible in 2018 as far as what might be achieved in specific use cases relative to autonomous?
That's where we get into the ADAS, the different levels of autonomous, 0 through 5, 4, 5. I think this year we'll see a lot more advanced ADAS systems in the level 3 area as opposed to complete full autonomy. There is a shift in the automotive industry between people who will drive a vehicle manually as people versus allowing the car to take control and drive independently and autonomously versus a car that is 100% autonomous when you think of level 4 and level 5. And it's definitely a spectrum that is going to come out. But at a certain point, the vehicle, I believe, will be 100% level 4, level 5, no steering wheel, no brakes, no need for any manual controls of the vehicle. And I think part of that is just the sheer number of sensors and how complicated the machine itself will be. These cars are not going to be owned. They're not going to be maintainable by your average consumer. I was looking up some of the statistics as to how many people actually upgrade their operating system on their phone. Most people don't do that. It's 34%. After a full year of a operating system update, they're still maybe at 50 or 60%. And that's not even looking at the number of people who drive around currently with malfunction indicator lights on, those idiot lights on their dashboard. They're saying check engine lights. People just don't maintain their vehicles. So I think the idea of the valet services are going to be really, really beneficial to bringing comfort to the general public with the safety of the machine operating autonomously. But eventually, and I think sooner rather than later, it'll need to just go to full autonomy.
Great. So let's shift over to Rishi really quick. So Rishi, IoT is having major impacts all over the world. Can you tell us about some of the specific things that IoT is making possible that's unique to the Asia markets?
Yeah, Christina, thank you very much for asking me this. We are in a different world altogether with around 1.3 billion people in India. The kind of challenges, the kind of requirements here are very different from the Western world. The cost pressures, as per the labor cost is concerned, is not here. And the price required to implement a project is very low. And the need is more, how can we cater for the billion of people who are not able to even get the basic needs? So the technology here is more required for how can we provide healthcare, how can we provide the basic things for the people who are not able to get majority of the things in the world. So sometimes, if I talk in terms of India, 70% of our population lives in the rural world, whereas the 75% of the paramedical staff lives in the urban area. So if the government really wants to provide the healthcare facilities, the only way it can happen is to remain remote patient monitoring. Otherwise, today we require around 2.4 million doctors to provide services to the unserved nation. And if we really want to provide the healthcare services, only way possible is the IoT. And same is the case when you talk about the transportation. We are doing huge amount of work in the insurance and the transportation logistics structure. And we are implementing a lot of solutions here in India and around Southeast Asia. See how can we help the transportation sector in managing the huge amount of commercial, non-commercial vehicles. Just wanted to give you one more example before I differentiate. On the autonomous cars or the autonomous vehicles, I'm not sure when we'll see these kind of things in India. While we are working on smart cities, while we are trying to create a better infrastructure and everything, but the autonomous vehicle is getting implemented in India in the farm sector. We have the autonomous tractors. We are trying to provide the autonomous tractors to the farmland owners who have small farmlands. And we are trying to say for 2 hours, 3 hours, how those autonomous tractors can be utilized. So the same technology, different use cases because our needs are different. Right. And that's where there's a huge difference for a 1.3 billion people who are very, very cost sensitive, and the kind of challenges and the use case requires are very, very different. But it is growing. We are really using this technology at a very, very high speed. And I'm sure we have our own challenges, we have our own needs, and we find our own solutions.
Absolutely. And one of the questions that's come in from the audience that kind of overlaps between both what Michelle and Rishi were talking about is the idea of using IoT to solve for the case of more shared automobiles rather than owned automobiles. And I know, Michelle, you started to bring up that idea. Can you expand a little bit on how we might expand into that in 2018 in the near term?
Yeah, I really, really appreciate that question. When you think about the premise that you're not going to own a vehicle anymore, you really are looking at a type of a subscription or ad hoc rentals, if you will, ad hoc calling of a vehicle. And what we're seeing right now in the automotive industry with Book by Cadillac and some things with Silver Car by Audi, and Porsche has a program, Lincoln has a program. They're all experimenting with different subscription models where you have a vehicle delivered to you, usually by a porter. You can change out the vehicle type over a period of time, and what you're paying for is the insurance, the maintenance, the usage and everything. And it's not a large leap to think of, instead of a porter bringing you a vehicle, the vehicle coming to you instead. Now, I think those kinds of models will be for the more discerning consumer who happens to be very, very brand loyal. So if you're a BMW aficionado, you might just stay within the BMW subscription family. But there are also a lot of other dealerships and other companies that are using different models, the same idea, but swapping out different cars that are at the more volume price point. And those could replace the Ubers and the Lyfts, or compete, I should say, with the Ubers and the Lyft, where they have a much different fleet composition, and you're just calling them as needed as compared to just subscribing for the vehicle.
I really like that topic. It's one of the reasons why I love that we're we have such a great market in India, is that it's a great place where there are going to be these situations where India leapfrogs the Western world, and I think it's very possible that just the model that you're talking about is something that might eventually come in the Western world, but it actually might come earlier in India, where things are evolving and developing actually more quickly than in the Western world right now.
Yeah, you think about the needs of identity management, micropayments, being able to know when vehicles need to be serviced. These are going to be real-time problems that need to be solved quickly. One of the things I was thinking about when Dr. Rishi was talking, and I'd actually like to ask him a question, if Christina doesn't mind, he was talking a lot about the commercial India, the commercial transportation needs in India. And one of the things I've been thinking about is how the commercial sector will probably see autonomous vehicles before the personally owned vehicles. And I could easily see commercial vehicles operating autonomously in a more constrained environment in a place like India and be very successful. But that's just a guess on my part. I'd love to know what Dr. Rishi thinks.
As a concept, this looks to be, something which is possible. But the infrastructure-wise, the roads and other infrastructure are not so great in this part of the world. And that will make it very difficult for the autonomous vehicles to work. Okay. And, there are so many challenges, infrastructure challenges here on the ground that, you have to have a very prescribed correct area where you will be in a position to use it commercially. So, in some of the smart cities which are newly getting developed or being developed, I personally believe this is possible and this will happen. But in general, in cities like, even Delhi and Bombay, where the infrastructure is very, you can't expand it further, it will be very difficult to use it commercially, is that my thought is.
Or it might be the ultimate test bed for technology.
Yeah. Yeah. So everybody, whenever I am in a meeting to commit something, everybody save me and say, don't commit, try to do something at a very smaller pace, because it's such a huge country with so many challenges that, there are so narrow roads sometimes in Delhi, whereas if a bull is coming, you won't be able to move further. So while sitting in Chicago and Santa Clara, you might not be able to imagine, but we still have places in Delhi where the roads are so narrow that, if a bull or a cow is sitting in between, the whole traffic stops. So,
So we're getting a bunch of questions in from the audience, and I'm going to circle back to some of the topics we've already touched on to try to address some of these. Let's start with this question. It's, what do you think about the interaction between smart vehicles and smart cities? I think we don't only need autonomous cars, but also smart roads to communicate with them and allow faster, smarter, and more secure rides. Who would like to take a crack at that?
Well, I'm happy to take a first stab, actually. I think it ties back into a little bit of what we were talking about before, that probably autonomous develops in little islands and specific use cases where actually there is at least a more controlled environment, if not a smart environment. So I go back to my valet parking example. In the United States, many parking garages have become connected and are starting to become relatively smart. So you certainly could imagine, going to the shopping mall or maybe going to a sports event and having an autonomous use case where really the vehicle is cooperating with the infrastructure. And, it's not like you can overnight connect the entire country and create a bunch of smart roads and smart infrastructure, but you certainly can create islands that make a lot of sense and have a really good ROI.
Yeah, I think in this country, in the United States, the car itself is going to have to basically be a hacker's delight. The car is going to have to be able to deal with a whole bunch of different kinds of standards as it moves from municipality to municipality. I just don't see the United States or maybe even India is having a single holistic system, something like what you see in Estonia or these kinds of places where they've done some really amazing unification around digitalization. We might see this in places like Singapore or some of the Gulf states. And like as Dr. Rishi was saying, in smart city projects where you're building these up from the ground up, and also in places like China. But you look at cities like London and Rome, and these are places where cars were never meant to be. These cities did not evolve with vehicles in mind. So seeing manually driven vehicles banned in these cities, or all vehicle traffic eliminated outside of commercial vehicles that are autonomous, just makes a lot of sense in the long term. But that really is the long term. I think Drew is spot on that in the near term, there are going to be these smaller pockets as the technology evolves and perfects before it spreads out widely.
Okay, so speaking of different types of areas, regional, rural versus urban, there's a question back on the healthcare discussion we had earlier for Rishi. He wants to know if you can give an example on how healthcare using IoT to reach remote rural locations can help beyond the diagnosis. So it's clear to them how we would use the diagnosis aspects of an IoT platform to be able to do that initial part of the patient care, but can we also use it to enhance care beyond that, the actual cure?
So, Christina, there are somewhere around 600,000 plus villages in India. As the first step, there are a small video conferencing room that has been created in those villages, which is part of the infrastructure creation. A standard equipments and some devices which are being put into those rooms. There is a huge project that is going on to connect all these villages using broadband connectivity. Okay, and which is more than 100,000 villages are already covered, and many more are being covered, and others are getting covered through cellular and other technologies. And how using these video conferencing facility, 1 person or 2 person per village will be trained to use those devices. And once a day, the doctors from the main cities will sit and talk to the patients in the villages. So for 2 hours a day, a doctor will sit and through a video conferencing facility, they'll sit they will talk to the patients, see the primary things, and will advise them whether they should come to the city for better checkup or better requirement or some more requirements, or they should stick to the village. You won't believe 60 to 70% of the travel from the villages to the urban area for the healthcare will stop because of such a small remote patient monitoring. These are the kind of things that will help the rural area start providing the first step of healthcare and health diagnosis. Because many people, just for the sake of say a fever, they'll travel to the city and just to get a ordinary medicine. For those kind of things, those people will be stopped to stay in the villages, and that is a huge program that is going on in India. The whole infrastructure created, training skills, devices, doctors, video conferencing, in the network interaction, everything has been prepared. So this is what is going on right now. And 100,000 villages getting connected by broadband. You can imagine at what scale this is happening. So, there were only 155,000 those small rooms in those villages which are present, with one lady which used to look after the child and women. And, now they are getting trained to look after everything. So all those things are being done. And how to utilize technology to provide such kind of services is what you can come and see in India.
Wonderful.
By the way, we actually have a few customers in Africa, working in Africa, that are doing amazing things as well with healthcare. In one case, I know a customer that is they're delivering vaccines. For those who don't know, actually 50% of all vaccines actually are destroyed. Either they get too hot or too cold in transport. If you think about that, 50%. And we're working with a company to monitor that whole delivery chain and make sure that those vaccines arrive and are healthy and workable. And we have a few other customers in Africa that are doing amazing things with our technology.
Wonderful.
We are doing the same thing in India also. In some of the states, we are providing those monitoring to ensure that the vaccines are getting properly transported.
And we're also using the IoT on motorcycles to where there are places that are hard to reach. I know I'm the woman that only cares about wheels, so bear with me here, but that we're outfitting some motorcycles with some devices that allow them to not just find the best routes to rural villages as they run samples for testing, but also help maintain their fleet of vehicles as they're out in very remote areas. It's really, really wonderful to see this confluence of the price of connectivity and the price of the sensors come down to a point where this becomes feasible.
Excellent. I'd like to direct the next question over to Z. The question is framed mostly around the utility sector, but it's around security, specifically how we can harden critical infrastructures. And Z, I know you have spoken a lot on this topic. We'd like to hear a little bit about how can we put some security around really critical aspects of our infrastructure like water and utilities.
That's a good question, and indeed, it's one of the ones that people are very concerned about. Security comes in let's put it this way, in a broad range of applicability, right? If I have a IoT application that is just measuring sensor data of a temperature somewhere, I really may not care too much about that device as long as it can't be taken over. We've had scenarios like the attack that took place in IoT devices about a year and a half, late 2016, for home and residential and business cameras that were taken over and used in a denial of service attack. Those are examples where people had not thought through the issues of what could happen if an IoT device is compromised, if it's breached. In the example of utilities, whether it's water or electric or power distribution systems, this has been a concern in the people who are concerned about the security in general. This has been a concern that those things are open to hacking, open to attack, and open to potentially cyber war, if you will, from nation states outside the United States, et cetera, et cetera. That's a big deal. It is something that is a concern. I will not tell you that the perfect solutions have been found, but there are certainly a lot of people paying a lot of attention to detection of attacks that take place, detection of breaches that might occur, and then trying to figure out how to prevent and mitigate those solutions. Isolating the utility is not the answer. As some people have been trying to say that maybe we should separate the internet from the utility infrastructure that we have. The problem is that we rely on IoT and other monitoring applications to run in a connected manner. So it has been a problem, and I will not tell you that the perfect solutions have been found, but that is an area where people are spending a lot of effort and time to see if standard security practices and beyond can be applied.
Definitely. And we know that there's a lot of attention put on critical infrastructure pieces, and that other areas of the industry tend to get less attention. And one of our audience members wants to know how can we as an industry hold the individual manufacturers of hardware and software, how can we hold them accountable to make sure that they're designing security into their systems? Is there some kind of standards or infrastructure that we need to put in place as an industry to make that possible?
Yes and no. I think that the guidelines for what needs to be implemented are being worked on quite literally as we speak. The entities like 1M2M that I had mentioned earlier are working on security architectures. There are other organizations associated with the automotive industry, with the utility industry, that are worrying about exactly what it takes to protect this infrastructure as best as we can. Do I think that the results have been perfect? Do I think that everything is perfectly protected? No. In fact, if I was to go out on a limb, I would say yes, there is going to be a potential security breach of some sort with an IoT device or a set of IoT devices associated with the utility industry that could happen very, very, very soon. And what is important is to detect it and be able to mitigate and isolate the problem as quickly as we can do so. And that's where people are paying a lot of attention at the present time.
And I think there's a lot, oh, sorry, Drew. I think there's a lot of collaboration happening, a recognition that there's not a single manufacturer or company that can do this alone. We see this with the Auto ISAC and with Faster, which is a security group that we're involved with. And there's a recognition within specifically the auto industry that there are best practices from other sectors that need to be brought forward and into the automotive industry. And that's something that I think is going to be very important, not just the monitoring, but the collaboration, since it's not a once and done, it's going to be constant.
Absolutely. In fact, one of the other things which I think Drew was perhaps about to allude to is that when you have as good as you can do security implementation, it may still need updates in the future. It may still need a change in the firmware because some new mechanism has been found that people have taken advantage of. Absolutely, things need to be done in the future as well. The question also related to whether or not companies should be doing, what can we do to make sure companies are following the best security practices? And I think the answer is a combination of certification and security by design, making sure that what we require companies to do has to be carefully thought through right at the implementation point, so that the possibility of a breach and the result of what could occur if a security breach happens is thought through, and appropriate mechanisms are taken to isolate the devices that may be in trouble, and then also to mitigate and change them down the road.
I guess where I was going was, I think the question's a really good one.
Yeah.
Do we need to get to a point where, just like we have kind of certifications to make sure a device is built, with electrical characteristics that are safe, do we need to get to that point that, systems are built and provided in a way that, data is secure, and that there's some at least minimum level of certification of that capability, and that they are actually held accountable in some way if that is not achieved?
It's going to take some time, but I totally agree with you, Drew. I think that certification and then regulations potentially down the road for critical infrastructure is going to make a big difference.
So there's a bunch of questions that came in during when Drew was talking about edge computing. I'd like to circle back to some of those. One of them is, Drew, do you see the edge computing being done on low-cost devices or expensive servers, or kind of a combination of both? Like, from a tactical perspective, what does that actually look like?
Yeah, I really think that it's all of the above. I think there probably needs to be edge computing environments. If we go back to the kind of standard environments that, there's at least a couple of levels of kind of constrained environments. But I think even the tiniest device, certainly there's embedded versus application level, or if you go back to thinking about how ARM processors work, they have M-class processors and A-class processors. So with different levels of constraints, there at least needs to be those two levels of edge computing environments, and probably even another level that's much richer. If you think about a car and where a car is going, back to what Michelle was talking about, and how much data is going to be generated out of some of these cars, they're almost like mobile data centers in a way. So they're going to have incredible capabilities to process data all the way down to, a good example of a very constrained environment would be more like the Fitbit or the wearable that you might wear on your wrist. So there needs to be edge computing environments that work in both of those cases.
So we also have the obligatory Skynet question. Basically, are we creating a situation where machines will take over the world? And what the audience is asking is, so are cars taking over humans, or are the humans taking over the machines? And are we really using them, or are they using us? the question is like, where does the responsibility lie in the end, and how are we going to make sure that people are taking personal responsibility when so much of the function is actually moved to the machine? Michelle, do you have a thought on that?
Well, I'm pro-robot, and I think I'm totally pro-robot, and I think that robots should have rights as they move up in the sentient chain. And I think the question, it's not an either or. It's kind of, it's a false premise. It's like, you know, our house full of goods. Do we own that house full of goods, or since most of them are going to outlive us, do they own us? And I think it's the same thing. I think it's actually working together. And if the robots are going to make our life better, then what's to be afraid of? Yeah, there's going to be definitely bumps in the road, but that's what keeps life interesting.
Is anybody on the panel not pro-robot?
You know,
All I can say, it's hard to top Michelle's answer there.
Yeah, exactly. The only comment I might add to that is that I think that we ignore the fact that most of these applications that are being developed today are still very, very limited in scope. And, you know, having a general purpose solution, a robot that can emulate a human being, is still decades away, if not longer than that, frankly.
That's true. And that actually opens up the question about how do we get to that long-term vision. And there's one here from the audience. They want to know if you guys have seen specific notable examples recently of new third-party niches that are springing up that allow us to apply all of these massive amounts of data we're getting from the IoT network, and then interpret and benchmarking that data in a usable and functional way. Who's doing a really good job of that right now, and why?
That's a darn good question, and I'm not sure I have an example of that. You know, we can look at the fact that data is being collected for non-IoT purposes, and the companies that are doing that are the traditional Googles of the world, etc. And the question is, are they looking at what possible IoT data that could be gathered and collected and interpreted in ways that we haven't quite thought through? Our customers are doing it in a very specific way for their applications, and that makes a lot of sense. On the other hand, a general purpose entity that is doing that across the board for all IoT applications, I don't know of a case yet. Drew, you might have heard of somebody.
Well, I think again, it's a great topic, and it's one that you know, we talk about a lot, and a lot of people in the industry talk about. A lot of business models in the Internet of Things actually center around the data and monetizing the data. And to monetize the data means that you have to be able to share it, which means you have to be able to share it in some secure and private, you know, way. And that's been the big blocker so far. And I'm sure that, you know, there's a lot of stories out there about things that are happening now. For example, you know, your Roomba robot wandering around your house and actually collecting data on the square feet of your house, and how that in itself is monetizable data. And, you know, how do you feel about the fact that, you know, your house characteristics are being monetized by your, you know, autonomous vacuum cleaner? And so it's an important topic, and it's one that, you know, certainly there are ways that people are finding to start, you know, sharing data, but we're still at the very beginning of all that. And yeah, Michelle, I think this is an area you've looked into quite a bit.
It is. When I think about making autonomous vehicles and mobility as a service a reality, I've been looking a lot at the airline industry as a proxy example. And I think about air traffic control. At a certain point, it doesn't help General Motors or Toyota or BMW to compete on perception and how a car actually moves through time and space autonomously. There's a lot more benefit to society to coordinate those actions. And where car companies will compete is on things that matter for their brand. And that might be things like route. It might be the type of vehicle, the shape and the capacity of the vehicle and the amenities inside of the vehicle, that's where you see a lot of the competition happening. But when you really think about the car driving itself, perception and turning and understanding its environment, that's going to be an area where the data should be shared, and it needs to be shared to make the whole system viable. Getting at that data and figuring out how to share it is not going to be easy. But as we look at data monetization, we'll probably start seeing some answers in how these car companies and others monetize the data. BMW is doing something very interesting in Europe around car data. And I think it's called actually car data. All the data they're pulling out of your individual car, they're making it transparent to the vehicle owner. And then you can decide what gets shared with third parties or not. And they're allowing monetization of that. Now, part of that is for regulatory reasons in Europe, but they also believe that transparency breeds trust. And I think that's just a first experiment in the larger picture of, are you going to be comfortable sharing how fast your car is driving and where it's going if it's anonymized, because it helps the hive understand how to transport better.
Michelle, you said something there which I think is very, very important. The anonymization of data is going to be critical. There are government regulations coming along. I mean, I think the GDPR in Europe, if you're not familiar with that, the General Data Protection Regulation that is going to come into force in May of this year, means that companies have to be very careful with information and data that could potentially be associated with an individual, or the regulations could apply, and then the penalties for breaching are extremely harsh. So we have to think through exactly what data can be made available and how it can be made available and to who is the data is going to, etc. Those are all issues that I don't consider that a chilling factor from the perspective that it won't happen. We just need to make sure that we do it right.
Thank you, guys. The next question is kind of a general question. I'd like to direct it to Rishi. Rishi, what is the advice that you would give for a business leader who is interested in using the Internet of Things to expand their business capabilities? And what's the biggest risks that they need to know about as they go into a new deployment?
See, if you are talking about the Indian territory or our Southeast Asian market, you should not be expecting large margins from per device implementation. It's a volume game. So you should come to this market with an expectation that you're talking about large volumes. So when I talk about vehicles, they are in millions. When I talk about cars, they are in millions. When I talk about humans, they are in billions. So that's the kind of volume we are talking about. So and the price points what we are talking about here are very low. Okay. So you should come with an expectation or with a mindset that no doubt it's a profitable market. We have started generating revenue, so that means there is market. But it's a volume game, and it's not a high margin per device kind of market. So if anybody wants to move from the Western world to India, they have to realize that the market is different, the use cases are different, the technology can work, but it's a long-term, large volume, low margin game, and you should be ready to play with that. If you are not, then it's not a market to come. But it's a large volume. And I always tell Trumwin, if you succeed in Indian market, so the price point India needs and the volume India offers, you are going to be successful anywhere else in the world. So the whole of Africa, whole of Latin America is just waiting for these solutions to succeed in our part of the world. If they succeed, it's a replication across that part of the world. So it's good to experiment here. There are huge amount of use cases required. Our challenges are different. So before Christina, leave this answer, I just want to give you an example. There was a French company which came to India to do the solid waste management. Okay. And they were interviewing me, and I'll just take 1 minute on this. And they said that they're going to charge me $10 a month for me or my wife to go out of my house with the garbage around 100 meters away to segregate and put it into different boxes. Okay. Whereas today, somebody comes to my house to pick up my garbage and I pay less than $2 a month. Okay. So how will you feel that if I'll be asked to take my garbage out and pay $10, it will succeed in India. So we are a different market, we have different needs, and you have to see how to utilize technology to provide me low cost and work on a large volume. That's where.
So we're gonna have to change to the song. If you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. But now we're talking about India, right?
Okay.
All right. So here's an interesting question that came in from the audience. They're positing, so blockchain requires a lot of computing power, and so loss in energy. How will that be improved, and how will it be evolved so that it can be sustainable and eco-friendly?
Well, that's a darn good question. Most of the blockchain computing power is actually used, I think one of the things that people need to understand is actually used in the mining process for creating new Bitcoins. The process of analyzing your transaction and inserting it into the chain is not as compute intensive. So a gateway product could do it. A sensor certainly will not, but a gateway product could do it. That is going to continue to be one of the issues with blockchain technology today, although people are looking at mechanisms to get around that. I doubt it will be a easy problem to solve.
But interesting to know that there's specific areas that are more intensive than others. So here's a really interesting question, and probably all of you have an opinion on this. So the question is, with the accelerating advancement of sensor technology and edge computing, reducing autonomous vehicles' reliance on anything that's outside the vehicle, do you think relying on smart city infrastructure for the purposes of autonomous vehicle navigation and safety will slow progress, will slow the evolution and adoption of autonomous vehicles? Michelle, you want to start with that?
Well, I didn't think that vehicles were relying on smart city infrastructure for navigation. A lot of that stuff by necessity needs to reside on board. And what you have the network and connectivity doing is providing information to reduce the compute load of the vehicle itself, and being able to update segments of the driving population as necessary. So this would be changing road conditions. You don't need to update the entire units in operation, just those within a radius that are impacted, to help make the car make better decisions faster. Not that the car is going to rely exclusively on connected information to make decisions about to turn right or left or to brake. Those still need to happen inside the vehicle itself with redundant systems. And I don't think that's going to necessarily change.
Okay. There's also a question about machine learning. And Michelle, I know that you started to touch on this earlier, but Drew or Z, could you guys weigh in on the value and importance of leveraging machine learning in IoT and how it will help the industry grow?
Yeah, I mean, I'll definitely start there. I mean, I think it's critical to IoT solutions. If I look at many IoT solutions that have actually been around for a while, I think there's a lot of, I like to think of them as maybe IoT 1.0 solutions that, usually they're kind of siloed solutions. They don't take advantage of data in a larger ecosystem. They're not necessarily smart solutions. In other words, they're not learning solutions that, they require a lot of manual configuration and manual analysis. The next generation of IoT solutions, and those are that's what we're really focused on, as well as how do you take the data, how do you learn from the data, how do you make recommendations and make the data be actually actionable and have the system improve. Machine learning is critical for the next generation of IoT solutions.
Oh, I entirely agree, Drew. I think the other point I might add to that is the fact that we're going to have millions to billions of devices out there generating tremendous amounts of data. And if we don't use machine learning techniques to go through that data, the purpose and value of gathering that data, transmitting that data, storing that data is kind of lost. And I think that there's no way we're not going to have to use machine learning techniques to get to the meat of the data, understand what it is that the purpose of that application was, and then really use it in ways that benefit rather than ways that just create gigantic data museums that go nowhere.
Great. So we're down to the last 2 minutes of our webinar, and I've got a good question here that I'd like a quick answer from each of you on. We're placing our bets for 2018. The question is, so IoT has tremendous potential across all areas: auto, healthcare, telematics, energy, security, traffic, smart cities. So I'd like each of you guys to place your bet for the area that will have the most growth in 2018. The biggest growth in IoT usage and the biggest impact to that industry. Let's start with Rishi. Where do you think you're going to see the biggest impact?
See, in India, the telematics is going on from quite some time. For 2018, my focus is definitely energy. Okay. There's a huge amount of work that is happening in India and the Southeast Asia for the energy part. Healthcare, definitely there's a lot of things happening. But as for the revenue is concerned, I'm not sure when will it come. Okay. If you're looking for a business impact, I'll bet on energy.
Energy. All right, Drew, what's your bet?
Sorry, I couldn't hear. Was that for me? For Drew?
Yeah, for Drew.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to go for, I know it's probably the oldest segment, been around a long time, but I'm going to go for telematics. If you're looking at a percentage basis, it may not be there, but I think from a pure numbers perspective, the big thing that's happening in telematics is we're moving towards every single vehicle being connected, and just the sheer numbers of vehicles is astounding. And while it's been around for a long time, really getting to the point where every single vehicle is connected is a big deal.
Great. All right, telematics. Avery, your bet?
I think it's going to be industrial IoT. I think it's time for old school manufacturing to start making a lot more bets on the IoT and really start seeing a lot more investments in payoff in the core of industrial IoT.
Interesting. And Z, what's your bet?
Darn good question. I'm going to give a slightly different answer. If you extend that 2018 just a little bit further, I think healthcare has the biggest potential, the most bang for the buck, because that's where costs are spiraling out of control in developed and undeveloped countries. And the more impact we can have in providing better IoT solutions in the healthcare industry, I think the better off we will all be in the long run, human-wise and cost-wise, etc.
Great. Okay, well, we've got a little bit over our time, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up now. Thank you to our panel. We appreciate your time today. And thank you to everybody who's joined in.